Of course, the Mac Studio and Studio Display stole the show at this week's event, and that's kind of all that I've been wanting to talk about, so I think it's time to mix things up a little bit and address the new iPad lineup, because Apple did finally streamline some things. Center stage is now standard across the lineup, and probably the most common point that I've seen brought up a lot between comments, Twitter, and Discord is just everyone saying, what is the point with the 11-inch iPad Pro now? Because the iPad Air 5, for only $600, is now offering the M1 chip. Basically, the 11-inch iPad Pro doesn't need to exist, right? What is the point of it in the lineup? Apple needs to kill it off. I don't get it. Well, in today's video, I'm going to be arguing as to why Apple is very comfortable putting the M1 chip in two separate iPads with totally different price points. Let's begin. As if Apple Silicon was the primary reason people spent more money on iPads, right? It was like, I love this iPad Air 4, but the A14 chip is just too dang slow. I need the M1 in here. Oh, now it's more affordable? No, I don't actually think that's how most iPad purchasing decisions go. However, I think Apple has already done a very similar lineup that they're fairly comfortable with, and maybe if this same lineup existed a couple years ago, I would be agreeing with more of you, but the truth is, with the iPhone lineup, Apple already has actually less than a $200 price difference between two devices that have the exact same size display, and the only difference is the features. They even have close to identical silicon on the inside with the iPhone 13 and 13 Pro. Both 6.1-inch devices, both OLED, and they're both sporting the A15 chip. Yes, I know one of them gets a couple extra gigs of RAM, but for the most part, keep in mind, these devices have fairly small differences to the everyday consumer, but the 13 Pro still sells pretty dang well. It's got a fair share of advantages like the ProMotion display, it's got some extra cameras, it's got LiDAR, it has a couple extra hours of battery life, but keep in mind, both the 13 and 13 Pro start with 128 gigs of storage. It's actually a bit of a different story if we're comparing the iPad Air 5 to the current 11-inch iPad Pro. So similar to the iPhone line, both have the same chip, both are powered by the M1, except one of them, just like the 13 Pro, has 120 Hz. In fact, it actually has a slightly brighter display at 600 nits versus 500, and it has a Thunderbolt port, whereas the iPad Air 5 still has regular USB-C, not quite to the full speed that Thunderbolt can handle, which if you're the type of person to care about, oh, I need the M1 chip because performance is what matters most at the end of the day on your iPad, then I think that type of demographic might care a little bit about having a faster connectivity option with the singular port that is on the iPad. And keep in mind, just like the difference between the 13 and 13 Pro, the iPad Pro has the ultra-wide, it has LiDAR, it has the flash, which shockingly, even though the iPad Mini 6 got flash, Apple didn't want to put it on the iPad Air 5. Not that this is a deal breaker feature, but I just thought it was interesting that they were like, yeah, Pro iPads, you get a flashlight, and iPad Minis, you get a flashlight, but if you're in between, you just don't need the flash. Maybe the argument is iPad Mini is smaller, therefore tablet photography is going to be more common with that device, but if that's the argument, then why throw the flash on the 12.9-inch iPad? Because that's the biggest one they got, and they were still comfortable throwing it on there. So this lineup is actually incredibly similar to the iPhone line if you consider there's more color options with the iPhone 13, just like there's more color options with the iPad Air, but they lean more into the tech specs when it comes to the iPad Pro, and that includes Face ID also being an option. With the True Depth camera system, Apple openly admitting on several occasions that Face ID, they believe, is the superior biometric to Touch ID, and if you are the type of person to care about having Face Unlock on your iPad, the Pro offers that, whereas the iPad Air does not. So there's even more differences actually comparing these two iPads than there are comparing the two iPhones, or they might have a similar number of differences, but I think everyday consumers are more likely to care about the differences between the Air 5 and the 11-inch Pro, particularly when it comes to storage, because, okay, every time an iPad Air comes out, or every time the iPad Pro gets refreshed, you guys know my answer. It's pretty much always, yeah, okay, kind of cool, but still, the much better value is just to get a certified refurbished 2018 iPad Pro, because personally, I do not see iPadOS being limited by the A12X chip. That's still plenty fast for an iPad. You can still do ProRes 4K at 60 video editing with LumaFusion on that 2018 device and get fast export times and a responsive screen. But many of you are like, well, I want the extra couple gigabytes of RAM, even though you can only run 2 applications or maybe 3 at a time. Or the more common argument is, well, I want to future-proof it. I want to buy this iPad and use it for 7-8 years. If future-proofing is your argument and you're just trying to make sure that this device lasts you more than half a decade, then I would argue storage is far more important. If that's your mindset, if that's your attack on this argument, then making sure that you get a little bit more than 64 gigs of storage if you're going to be downloading new games or movies or storing lots of pictures and videos on this thing for many, many years to come, you may want more than 64 gigs, and that's another limitation, in my opinion, of the iPad Air 5. Okay, it's really cool they threw an overpowered chip in there, but it still ships with 64 gigs by default, and just like my biggest complaint with the iPad Air 4, there's no 128 gig option. You have to go to 256 gig if you want more than 64, which I think it's more likely for people to say, yeah, 256 is too much, 128 is just right. And guess what the 11-inch iPad Pro starts at? For only $200 more, it starts at 128 gigabytes of storage. So, as much as people are like, yeah, the silicon's the same, what's the big deal? Why does anyone need to buy an iPad Pro now? I would argue it's actually very similar to how Apple has placed the 13 and 13 Pro, and keep in mind, whenever we look at sample sizes, the 13 Pro and the 12 Pro of a couple years ago still ended up selling pretty dang well, even though it was very similar to that of the iPhone 12 series. I think the storage difference is probably the biggest thing keeping the iPad Pro alive, because for the sake of longevity, getting a little bit more than 64 gigs, I do think matters. But if you guys are asking for my advice at the end of the day, yeah, I'm not budging. I still think the 2018 iPad Pro for $520 is unbeatable value, and I honestly don't think these M1 iPads are going to get substantially more software updates than the A12X. I think the A12X iPads are probably going to get like 8 or 9 years of software support, and the M1 might get 9 or 10 years. It's like 1 year difference, and also keep in mind, iPadOS doesn't really change much year over year. Every once in a while they add some new multitasking thing or some new Apple Pencil feature, but frankly, the iPadOS updates over the past few years have been fairly underwhelming and not that major, so don't worry about the longevity argument. Like, I'm keeping my 2018 iPad Pro and I'm happy with it, and even if it stopped getting software support, I would probably keep using it, because in the latest iPadOS they ruined the home screen, they got rid of the Today view, and pretty much just added 3 dots on the top of all your apps, because you gotta have a quicker multitasking menu. Basically, they just drag over some iOS features here and there, but they still can't do a calculator or weather app, which means, in my view, if you want an iPad and you want it to be good and last you a long time, get the 11-inch iPad Pro for a little over $500. And if you want more than 64 gigs of storage, you can also typically find a certified refurbished iPad Pro from 2020 for only $600. So the same price as the iPad Air, and it's got 120 Hertz, it's got Face ID, it's got 2 cameras and LiDAR and the flash on the back. A12Z chip is perfectly fine, and it will last you a very long time. So that's why I personally understand why Apple is keeping the 11-inch Pro and the Air 5 in the lineup. Not to mention they're gonna refresh the 11-inch Pro later in the year. Although Quo is saying it may not have mini LED, which isn't great. I think everyone was kind of hoping to get more XDR on the smaller size iPad, but even then, if your argument is, well, the better chip is more for longevity and overhead and planning for the future, well, guess what? The new iPad Pro is coming out in another 6 months. They're gonna have the M2 chip. So now, your iPad Air 5 is not going to get as many software updates as the M2 chip in the 11-inch Pro. So I don't think the silicon in your tablet should dictate much of your purchasing decisions, especially as long as iPadOS is fundamentally limited as it is right now. And I think that because Apple has seen success with the iPhone 13 and 13 Pro coexisting comfortably, they have no problem keeping the iPad Air 5 and 11-inch Pro together. What do you guys think of the current iPad lineup? Do you think it makes sense? Do you think there's too much overlap here? Feel free to let me know down in the comments below. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you all in the next one.